The Canadian wilderness in midwinter is a place of stark beauty and unforgiving cold. Snow blankets the landscape in an endless white expanse, the air sharp and biting. For Julia and Mark, this was their favorite time of year, a chance to explore the serene beauty of nature on their snowshoe treks. On this particular day, as they trudged through a dense forest near their cabin, a faint, plaintive sound stopped them in their tracks. The cry was weak, almost drowned out by the whisper of the wind, but it was unmistakably a call for help. Following the sound, they came upon a small, huddled figure, a young Canada lynx, barely moving, its fur dusted with snow. The lynx's golden eyes, dulled by exhaustion, met theirs for a fleeting moment before it collapsed completely. Julia gasped. "Mark, we can't just leave it here." Mark hesitated, knowing the risks of intervening with a wild animal, but the sight of the frail creature spurred him into action. They quickly wrapped the lynx in a spare blanket and carried it back to their cabin, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Little did they know, this moment would change their lives forever. The trek back to the cabin was grueling. The snowstorm had intensified, and every step felt heavier under the growing drifts. Julia cradled the lynx tightly, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. Despite the layers of blankets, she could feel the animal's body trembling weakly. When they finally reached the warmth of the cabin, Mark set about preparing a makeshift bed near the fireplace. Julia gently unwrapped the lynx and laid it down, its small frame barely rising with each labored breath. Its fur was matted with ice, and the pads of its paws were raw and bleeding. "We need to keep it warm," Julia said, draping another blanket over the lynx. She rummaged through their supplies and found a heating pad, placing it underneath the bedding to stabilize its body temperature. Mark prepared a bowl of lukewarm water, dipping his fingers in to gently moisten the lynx's dry nose. "It's so small," he murmured, worry etched across his face. "Do you think it's a juvenile?" Julia nodded. "It can't be more than a few months old. It must have been separated from its mother." As the hours passed, the lynx began to stir slightly. Its ears twitched at the crackling of the fire, and its eyes opened briefly, revealing a glimmer of life. Encouraged, Julia and Mark decided to try feeding it a mixture of softened cat food and water. The lynx resisted at first, too weak to fully respond, but eventually, it licked at the offered food. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Watching the young lynx take those tentative first steps toward recovery, Julia and Mark felt a flicker of hope. They had saved it from the snow, but the true challenge was only beginning. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, illuminating the young lynx as it lay curled in its makeshift bed. Though still weak, it had survived the night, a small but significant victory. Julia and Mark knew they couldn't handle this alone. Wildlife care required expertise they didn't have. After a quick breakfast, Mark called the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center, explaining the situation. "We're stretched thin," the center's director said regretfully. "This winter's been harsh, and we've taken in more animals than usual. We can offer advice and guide you, but we can't take the lynx right now." Disappointed but undeterred, Julia and Mark decided to care for the lynx themselves while following the center's guidance. They named the lynx Luna, inspired by its silvery fur that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Their first task was creating a safe space for Luna. Mark converted a section of their storage room into a quiet enclosure, lined with soft blankets and heated pads. Julia researched the lynx's dietary needs, improvising with nutrient-rich meals recommended by the center, a blend of high-protein cat food, raw meat, and vitamin supplements. At first, Luna was wary of her human caretakers, retreating to the farthest corner of her enclosure whenever they approached. Over the next few days, however, she began to show signs of trust. Her golden eyes followed them as they moved around, and she tentatively accepted food from Julia's hand. Despite Luna's progress, the couple remained cautious. Julia spent hours scouring online forums and articles about lynx rehabilitation, while Mark monitored Luna's health, noting any changes. Their cabin became a hub of activity, their lives revolving around the fragile animal they had vowed to protect. For Julia and Mark, caring for Luna wasn't just a challenge, it was a calling. Luna's fragile state demanded constant attention. Julia and Mark worked in shifts, ensuring someone was always nearby to monitor her. Feeding times were particularly challenging. Luna struggled to eat, her small body seemingly too weak to manage even the softest food. "She's not getting enough nutrients," Julia fretted one evening as Luna pushed away her food. "If this keeps up," she trailed off, unwilling to say what they both feared. Mark nodded grimly. "We need to try something else." After consulting the Wildlife Center again, they learned about syringe feeding, a technique to ensure Luna received essential nutrients. It wasn't easy. Luna, though weak, resisted fiercely at first, her claws instinctively swiping at the syringe. But with patience and care, Julia and Mark developed a routine, gently coaxing Luna to take small amounts of liquefied food. As the days turned into weeks, Luna's condition began to improve, slowly but noticeably. Her once dull coat grew shinier, and her golden eyes regained a spark of vitality. She started to explore her enclosure, her movements tentative but growing stronger. The couple faced setbacks too. One morning, they noticed Luna limping, favoring her front paw. A closer inspection revealed an old frostbite injury that had worsened. Mark contacted the center again, and they recommended an ointment to aid healing. Applying it became a nightly ritual, one that Luna eventually tolerated with surprising calm. The emotional stakes weighed heavily on Julia and Mark. They had grown deeply attached to Luna, her fragile resilience stirring something profound in them. Every small victory, a paw healed, a playful swat at a toy, felt monumental. But they were also acutely aware of the challenges ahead. "Do you think she knows we're trying to help her?" Julia asked one night as Luna dozed by the fire. Mark smiled faintly. "I think she does. And I think she's fighting because of it." Their bond with Luna deepened with each passing day. She was no longer just an animal in need, she had become a part of their lives, a living testament to the power of compassion and determination. But as Luna's strength returned, so too did the question they had been avoiding: what would happen when she was ready to go back to the wild? As Luna grew stronger, Julia and Mark knew they had to shift their focus. Luna was a wild animal, and her ultimate place was back in the wilderness where she belonged. The thought of letting her go filled them with conflicting emotions, pride in her recovery, but also sadness at the impending farewell. The first step was helping Luna rediscover her natural instincts. Julia and Mark consulted extensively with wildlife experts, learning how to encourage behaviors essential for her survival. They constructed a larger outdoor enclosure behind their cabin, complete with logs, rocks, and hiding spots to simulate a more natural environment. At first, Luna seemed hesitant in the new space, sticking close to the familiar enclosure wall. But as days passed, her wild nature began to shine. She practiced stalking imaginary prey, her body low and her movements calculated. Mark introduced a tethered lure, which Luna pounced on with growing confidence. "She's getting there," Julia said one afternoon, watching Luna's sleek form dart through the snow. "It's like she's remembering who she is." The couple also weaned her off human interaction. They reduced direct contact, leaving food at random spots in the enclosure to encourage foraging. Luna's growing independence was bittersweet. She began spending less time near the cabin and more time exploring her enclosure's farthest corners. One snowy morning, Julia noticed something remarkable. Luna had caught a small bird that had ventured into her enclosure. It was a pivotal moment, proving she was regaining the skills she needed to survive in the wild. As Luna's confidence grew, the couple worked with wildlife officials to identify a suitable release site, a remote area with ample prey and minimal human activity. The logistics were painstaking, but Julia and Mark were determined to give Luna the best chance at thriving. The evening before her release, they sat by the fire, watching Luna through the enclosure's window. She was perched on a log, her golden eyes scanning the horizon. "She's ready," Mark said softly. Julia nodded, though her heart ached. "She's ready." It was a moment they had been working toward for months, yet it felt impossibly hard. Luna was more than a rescue, she was a symbol of resilience, trust, and the bond they had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The day of Luna's release dawned clear and cold, the snow glistening under the morning sun. Julia and Mark prepared in silence, their emotions a mix of excitement and sorrow. Luna, now fully grown and vibrant, paced her enclosure with an energy they hadn't seen before. It was as if she knew this was her day. Wildlife officials arrived with a transport crate designed to ensure Luna's safety during the journey. Mark and Julia worked together to coax Luna into it, using patience and calm movements. Though Luna hesitated, her trust in them prevailed, and she stepped inside with a final, piercing gaze. The drive to the release site was quiet, the hum of the truck broken only by the occasional sound of Luna shifting in her crate. When they arrived, they were greeted by a breathtaking expanse of wilderness, towering pines, rolling snow-covered hills, and the faint sound of a distant creek. It was the perfect new home for Luna. The officials set the crate on the ground, opening the door slowly. For a moment, Luna hesitated, her golden eyes scanning her surroundings. Then, with a graceful bound, she leapt into the snow, her silvery coat blending seamlessly with the landscape. Julia and Mark watched in awe as Luna paused at the edge of a clearing, turning back to face them one last time. Her gaze lingered, a silent connection that spoke volumes. Then she disappeared into the forest, her sleek form vanishing like a whisper in the wind. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, but their hearts were full. Luna's journey had been one of survival, resilience, and a bond they would never forget. In the weeks that followed, Julia and Mark shared Luna's story with the world, inspiring others to care for wildlife and support conservation efforts. Donations poured into local wildlife centers, and awareness campaigns about the importance of preserving habitats gained momentum. Luna's release wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a movement. Her survival had changed not just her life but also Julia and Mark's, leaving an indelible legacy of hope and the extraordinary power of compassion. As snow fell softly outside their cabin, Julia looked out at the wilderness. Somewhere out there, Luna was thriving, and that thought filled her with pride.